Hey everybody, I'm ready.
And I'm Hardy.
Actually, it is Hardy. Hardy was the big guy, wasn't he? I think we did that last week. The Laurel was
Laurel
was the smaller guy. We're off center again. We need to slide over here just a little bit.
What's this about having to be in center? Life's
Well,
not always in center. It's not always just ordered.
It's
so.
becoming more important to me
Now
as
I'm sitting on some
as I'm aging. That seems wrong too. There
lump. It's right in an awkward place.
Oh yeah,
there.
you're on the futon. You're on the crossbow of the futon.
Well, hey, did you see where my New England Patriots blew up the internet yesterday?
Yeah, they released Cam Newton.
Cam Newton.
How do you feel about that?
Well, the fun reason behind that is they're hyper confident in Mac Jones. Heard that
the
name
Alabama
before?
guy. Are they really?
No, that's why.
That's the number one guy?
He was the 15th. They picked him up the 15th pick in the first round.
Okay.
He has been ridiculous. They have one of the hardest, some would say the hardest offense
to learn,
the Patriots. Right. And they're talking about his pre-snap reads, the accuracy. You know, he's this guy who's not this big, flashy. He doesn't have the Justin Fields or Trey Lance arm. These guys that got picked ahead of him, and
Trey Lawrence.
You know, those guys.
Trevor
Lawrence.
Yeah.
Trey Lance. Who, you know, spectacular talents.
Right.
But
smart.
Very smart and very accurate. This combination of
that matters to Nick Saban.
Right.
He is not for throwing it to the other team.
No. And Belichick, who have been close friends and have worked together for, you know, on teams in the past.
I wonder even how much that influenced. I'm sure they talked.
Oh, yes.
You know, okay, tell me about Mac.
Oh, no, that was there's
very interesting.
So they're going with, so this will be the first time Belichick's ever as a rookie.
He was behind Drew Bledsoe. I remember the game where they put him in.
Right.
And I remember listening to it on the way back from your house because that's what they were playing, and because I was up north.
Okay.
And I was listening to it on the radio, and it literally he was like throwing a football in a scrimmage game in the park. I'm like, because you know Drew Bledsoe was so good.
Right, and that was there was his second year. So that first year, now Belichick kept him because he saw something. And I've since read he almost started him, that was actually something he had considered because he saw enough things. Anyway, the bottom line here is, even in the preseason, now again, you're not playing against the best players and so on, but I think I read...
Sometimes you're playing against players that aren't going to make the cut.
Right. But I think I read that he had, in the preseason games, had 13 drives where he got the ball. So he had 13 drives. Every one of them ended up in a field goal or touchdown.
That seems good. If scoring matters.
Right. So anyway, you nailed it. The part that didn't throw a single interception, extremely accurate, throwing where guys can catch the ball. So it's a very fun, at least from a Pat's standpoint, I'm a fan, to see what happened. Here's a rookie. He's gonna have his rookie mistakes, but they said his odds shot up to be rookie of the year once he was named. So it was two things going on. He was named the starter, and then Cam was released.
Well, and I read in one place that he missed some camps due to some health protocols that he was confused about.
Right.
Which
was critical. In other words, there was a 5-day stretch last week. Some confusion, whatever, which people are pointing to. Okay, this means he's unvaccinated.
Okay.
Because the protocols that were applying to him are to unvaccinated people.
Okay, gotcha.
And so he had to sit out 5 days. And Mac Jones, who was already having a good preseason, was playing well, was lights out there. Anyway, so don't want to talk about it.
So did you see who made the starting quarterback for the Broncos? I'm actually very excited about this.
Is it Bridgewater?
Teddy Bridgewater.
Yeah.
Because I feel like Drew Lock, if he had 3 years behind somebody watching, learning, because when you throw them in to the Wolves on day one, it can get in their head,
right?
And then they never become the quarterback they could be. I'm like, yeah, Drew needs to watch. She needs to watch the game. He needs to watch the speed of the NFL. He needs to keep learning.
Right.
Bridgewater obviously has done well in a couple of places.
Yes, I'm impressed with Teddy Bridgewater.
Incredibly well. So I'm hoping that the defense of the Broncos and his ability to not only throw the ball but run the ball will give Denver a little different look on offense.
Yeah. No, I would feel very good about Teddy Bridgewater.
Yep. I'm kind of excited about our first Broncos game.
You've got a tough conference.
Well, yeah, there is that little guy over there at the Arrowhead. What are they? Patrick Mahomes. Yes.
And people are fairly high on the Chargers this year too. I don't know enough, but I'm saying people that do know.
$400 million quarterback. That's I can't even imagine that. One last thing on football.
These salaries.
Yeah, well, yes, I would love to just make the minimum in the NFL. Wouldn't that be fun? Just the minimum across the board. You're like a complete loser, but you get $125,000 a year just to show up. I'm like, I
could work with that.
I will show up. I'll be happy to show up
for working half a year.
No, I was thinking there was another. I was going to ask you because you probably know you track sports more than I do. So did Tim Tebow make the cut?
No.
Well, dang it! That seemed like that could be just fun.
No, he was released, and the pundits had fun with that. Yeah, I just love the guy for his tenacity, his what's the word, persistence or
resilience. He should have played for Tennessee. We are a resilient football team in Tennessee. We're not any good, but we are resilient. Every year we play in the SEC. We haven't dropped out yet. We haven't quit. That's resilience right there. And they're talking about changing that into like 4 leagues now. I don't even know what.
Well, they're adding Texas and Oklahoma, which 2 more losses for Tennessee.
that you're taking a powerhouse conference and now you're making it a powerhouse, right. A super powerhouse. I don't even understand.
And so now
every year we're going to get Oklahoma, Texas, Alabama, and Florida. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know how all that's going to work out, but
I do. Tennessee's going to have 3 wins, all non-conference, and we're going to have 9 losses because they might go to 9 games. I mean, 9 SEC games. I'm like,
I saw they named their starting quarterback.
Or is it 10 SEC? Did they? Who's their starting quarterback?
Some transfer from.
Please say UCLA.
Michigan or whoever they've had. I don't.
Okay, that could be good.
Whoever the guy was coming in that he's named, he's the starter.
Okay.
So,
bless your heart. You're going to see a lot of blue sky. When you're laying down, looking up, seeing the clouds. You may not see it clearly, but that's what you're seeing.
Get used to the weight of a lot of linemen.
A shadow of people around you going, "Are you okay? How many fingers am I holding up?"
When you go to bed at night, just start sleeping under a 300-pound blanket.
Don't get me wrong. I love football season because right now the Broncos are undefeated and Tennessee is undefeated. And I'm like,
until tomorrow night.
Do they play tomorrow night?
I think so.
Who does?
Tennessee.
Who do they play?
I don't know.
Let's hope it's not Oklahoma. Our Oklahoma.
I think they have a starter Thursday. Yeah. Well, Oklahoma and Texas don't join the league till
maybe it's Tulane. That could be okay.
Years.
We could do Tulane.
And it's still iffy.
Is that the Green Wave? I don't even know what they are.
It is. I think it's the Green Wave.
I mean, who names their team, their mascot like a Green Hornet? Because that's what I think of. The Green Lantern, the Green Hornet, the Green Wave.
But the Green Wave, I mean, what's your costume there?
Well, Crimson Tide. That's also a red wave.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
So, but the Green Wave, it just doesn't work as well. Seawater. Yeah. You kind of ride those things. So I have an idea of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet you do.
Question for you, Raj.
All right. I'm ready.
So are the words church discipline ever mentioned anywhere in the Bible? Ever?
Not that I am aware of.
We're testing Roger's Bible knowledge, which is iffy because he sometimes forgets things that he already knows, but that's okay.
Was I right or wrong here?
You are correct.
Okay.
You are correct. So it's an
Very
interesting,
happy about
it's an
that.
interesting concept, and it's an interesting term. I'm using church discipline as a singular term. It's an interesting term that gets thrown around in Christian circles and churches. And the idea is what?
You're asking me what?
Yeah, what did when you think of church discipline, what comes to mind?
Well, I'm gonna tell you. When we were growing up, the word discipline meant a spanking.
Yes.
So, a corrective punishment. Our parents would say, "We're doing this for your own good."
Yes.
Which then made it much easier to receive at that point. Please, then spank me harder.
Right, spank me more.
Because I want to be better.
Good. I want more good in my life.
This is so good for me. So, yes, I think the idea is that you are giving a corrective punishment that's going to make the church better and
hopefully help the person be better. Which seems to be where the Corinthian church sort of got it wrong. So the two places that, in my experience, most come to mind, or that people talk to me most about, is the passage in Corinthians where the guy that's sleeping with his stepmother, his father's wife.
Okay. Yep.
And the church was like, "That's cool, we're good with that." And Paul was like, "No, you shouldn't be good with that. You got to remove him. That can't go on. That doesn't even, not even the pagans are doing that kind of stuff."
Right.
The other one being, I referenced this briefly last time in Matthew 18, where Jesus says, "If a brother sins against you, go to him. And if he listens to you, then you've won your brother over." In other words, the relationship is reconciled. But if you won't listen, take 2 or 3 others so the matter can be established. This was even a Jewish understanding of how you establish something in a court of law. So if there's 2 other people, let's say I feel like you've sinned against me. You're like, "No, I don't think so, Bruce." I might get Joy and Marlena and just say, "Roger, you're wrong. Absolutely, that was a sin against Roger."
That's pretty safe assumption.
And then
I screwed it up.
But if you refuse to listen, then Jesus says, take it to the church, the gathering, the assembly, the ecclesia, which, I don't know totally what that means, the church. At the very least, it seems to be a larger group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And if he refuses to even listen to them, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector.
Right.
So all that to say, in that context, Jesus seems to be talking about one brother sinning against another brother. Okay. Mm-hmm. And maybe ways that you can bring reconciliation in that situation. What's interesting about that is how Jesus finishes the whole thing. Treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. And I'm like, well, how did Jesus treat pagans and tax collectors? Well, he loved them. He ate with them. He spoke with them. He
welcomed. That's a phrase.
It's a word. He welcomed them. Yeah. So what is that? Yeah, I'm still wrestling with that. What does that mean? So a lot of people believe that means to shun them. The idea of you're going to treat them as pagan, you want to shun them. And when you look at Paul's teaching about this person that was sleeping with his stepmother, his father's wife, remove him from the fellowship, which is sort of I'm using a broad term, a shunning move. Mm-hmm. We're going to separate you. You can't be a part of we because you're acting in a way that's inappropriate.
Right.
Comes back in the second letter, though, interesting enough, and says, "Holy cow, you guys it's like you guys are the angry elves, and let him back in. The guy's repented. And it's almost like they had taken this concept of once you're out, you're out. But there was something that took place that Paul recognized, and he said, you got to receive this person back then."
Well, I think even there you're getting at, even you're separating this idea between retributive or a punishment so much as we think about a word we use is rehabilitation.
Right.
So I'm talking about even if we think about prison, now there's all kinds of thorny questions around that, especially in our culture.
Right.
But is that simply punitive, or in retributive, you're getting your just rewards, you're getting punished.
Retribution, yeah.
Or what piece of that is an attempt to wake you up, a wake-up call, a chance for you to shift and change. You somehow realize now how serious this is, and you realize the loss. I'm outside of the community. I'm separated, and so now I have a chance to think about how much I missed that. What I had there. I have a chance to rethink my ways and so on. It seems that one of the things that Paul is clearly pointing to here, when the church is responding to broken relationships within or broken behaviors, the heartbeat isn't punitive. The heartbeat is restorative.
And that is why, this is what I'm going back to. I think that because when I look at the very next passage, so Jesus does this teaching, then Peter came to him and asked, Jesus, how often should I forgive someone when they sin against me? In other words, how often should I continue to be restorative? There's certainly a limit on this. And I had forgotten it was in that context. It says, then Peter came. So Jesus has done this teaching. He's like, yeah, but how often do we do that, Jesus? I mean, come on. Guys, and Jesus had already talked about it. If someone sins against you 7 times in a day and repents, forgive them.
Yeah.
So Jesus says, no, absolutely not. 70 times 7, 490 times. He said, let me give you an example of why this is so important. He said, say there's a master who's settling accounts with his people, his servants, and one of them owes 10,000 talents, which I don't know the exact amount, but it's in the millions of dollars. So let's call it $10 million.
Okay.
No way the guy's paying that back. Doesn't have it. There aren't servants that have $10 million. There's no way for him to pay it back. So the master is going to order him to go in prison and his family be sold and his property be sold to pay the debt. And the guy falls on his knees and begs him and says, hey, give me time. This is what's interesting. Give me time and I'll pay back all that's owed. Mm-hmm. Now, in that moment, the master knows, I appreciate the sentiment, but that's actually not possible. There's no way in heck you're ever going to come up with $10 million. You can't. It's not going to happen. But he has compassion on him. He has mercy. Extends that mercy to him and says, the debt's forgiven. Mm-hmm. So this guy, Home Skillet, goes out and there's another guy that owes him $10. And he says, I'm going to have you thrown in jail until you can repay it all. And the guy falls on his knees and begs him, said, hey, please give me time and I'll pay you the $10, which is very, very doable. But the guy refused and had him thrown into, debtor's prison. Well, all the other servants were horrified. As well, they should be. They went back and told the master, hey, did you hear what Home Skillet did? He just put a guy in jail for $10. Master calls him in and says, you should have had mercy. Did you forget what I did for you? You should have had mercy for him. I tell you what, you're going to prison until you can pay the $10 million, which means it's a life sentence. Mm-hmm. It's a forever sentence.
Right.
Then Jesus said this is so sobering. This is how your heavenly Father will treat each of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. Hoping Roger has something to say in relation to that.
Well, it seems like you've moved down a whole other channel. I'm trying to reorient.
Well, I'm going back to, because the goal is always restoration.
Right.
The Father's heart is restoration. Yeah. The heart of Jesus is restoration. Jesus says there's no limit to forgiveness. I always want there to be restoration. But if you refuse restoration, the consequences are not good.
Yeah, I'm going back because I think this is so significant. Even when we think about the church community. So here's this group community full of screw-ups. We get the earliest clue with Jesus and the 12.
Right.
There's this just beautiful initial picture of, first of all, that God loves an eclectic group. God loves a screwy group, issues, dysfunctions, whatever. He's going to call together a community of people very, very different. We've talked about that a dozen times, just how diverse that group was. They're immature at points. They're clamoring for who's in control. There's issues between them and conflicts, and they
They're
want to call
arguing
down
a
fire.
whole lot about who's the greatest.
Often, even the night the night Jesus is going to die.
Yep.
They're wanting to call down fire on the Samaritans. Let's destroy them. And so there's all this stuff. And Joy and I talked about this the other day. We're just thinking, just the myth of the perfect church, the myth of the. Listened to a podcast a few days ago about just so many people disillusioned with the church and where it is right now, and the podcasters were wrestling with. So why don't we bail? Why don't we give up? But what hit me as I was listening, and they weren't making a call for that. There was a very fascinating conversation. But I thought we have this myth about the church just being. It's always been screwy. In other words, the myth there was a gold. Somehow there was a golden year of the church. But you track all of church history.
Oh yeah, the church in Acts.
The church in Corinth.
Which church in Acts, by the way? But
right,
we always talk about the church in Acts, but there was a lot of churches that were talked about in the book of Acts. But it was a mess too.
Church in Corinth is a mess. James has some very strong words to the believers who are abusing the poor. They're not paying him wage. They're treating them.
You had greed going on in the church in Acts because certain widows were being overlooked. Interesting enough, you had greed, deception, betrayal going on. Ananias and Sapphira. It was just
well. Look at the letters to the churches.
The church in Acts was not the perfect church, Raj.
No.
Wow.
Well, then you look at the churches in Revelation. Big, whatever those 7 churches.
Right. Each of them had something good that they were getting right, but each of them was partly wrong.
All of them, the angel of the Lord calls out, and sometimes it's pretty serious stuff. Whether it's doctrinal stuff, whether it's apathy,
stuff.
What you love. So where I'm going with that is the church has only ever always been a bunch of screw-ups that's not getting it all right. The idea that I would leave a church or leave the church, I'm just going to bail because it's so screwy these days.
Right.
Don't buy this thing. The church is so screwy these days. It's always been.
Right.
No, really, it's always been.
It's never not been.
Now, I bring this in the context then, but what does God want that screwy community to do with the screw-ups, with they're going to have doctrinal things messed up. They're going to have relational things messed up. He's always calling them, don't ignore it. Go into the tunnel of chaos. So even when we talk
don't ignore it, restore it.
I like it.
Isn't that good? We can get t-shirts.
But
the Inglorious Pastords, don't ignore it, restore it.
So I look at that with, okay, there's a pretty serious behavioral thing going on here. No, you're just... And maybe they were just looking the other way. We do need to, because I felt that at points. I think there's some of us who are in that. It's just easier to look the other way, not speak into it. And the call of Jesus and the apostles, nope. When there's behavior that's unhealthy and and they're not repentant, you got to move into that. When there's a relational breakdown, how often do you say in a church there's a relational breakdown and we just look the other way?
Yep.
Or I'm just going to go to another church.
Oh yeah.
No, Jesus, because he loves the church. How do screwy people? We got to take steps to restore each other.
Yeah.
This word constantly about restoring, even in Galatians 6:1.
Yep.
If a brother is overtaken in a fault, in a sin, they become entrapped, they become ensnared. Now we come in as restorers. We don't come in as punishers.
No, he said restore them gently.
Gently, yes. This is a word that
recognizing your own propensity for the same sin.
And didn't Paul also said wasn't that what he was saying in 2 Corinthians? Wait, you guys have become harsh.
Right.
This whole idea of this separating for a time, the goal of that was always we want that person back home. We want that person back in the community. Sometimes you have to draw a line where you're saying we can't ignore this. Isn't this also part of the call of the communion table? When we come together as one, celebrated with one loaf, God has brought us together as one. If I'm actively going against some part of the heart of God, I'm working against his kingdom in the world, I'm working against this community, I need to address that.
Yeah.
And so communion was always about that. This was actually a time where we examine ourselves. We see, well, I think even one part of this separating, what someone called discipline, is, okay, we're going to say someone's not going to take the Lord's table if they're actively, we're not saying sinners can't, because that would be no one can, but if someone who is actively working against the heart of God, they're not repentant, they're not wanting to change.
It's a word that we would say is rebellion against God.
Right. And it's just, and there's a kind of arrogance. I'm going to just do what I want to do. Well, again, we're not coming to punish them and saying, well, then you can't take the Lord's table anymore. You can't. No, no, this is a table that's about unity. It's a table about loving one another. And if we're choosing to do the wrong thing.
Isn't that, I just thought of an interesting, I never thought of it this way, but it's interesting. On the night that Jesus broke the bread, there was one person that left the table of his own choosing.
Yeah. Interesting.
Judas. He left the table.
Right.
Jesus' heart was always this restoration. I even think about the what we call the woman caught in adultery. That particular story. Jesus is very restorative at the end. Neither do I condemn you. Go, continue on, and leave your life center. Leave this relationship that's destroying you and destroying others, destroying another marriage relationship. Leave that. But there was no condemnation, no criticism, no punishment, no here's your penance.
Yeah.
Is it get up, go on. Now leave that, but leave that.
And where I think
she left restored.
Yeah.
Interesting. Instead of stoned. Because that was the goal of the people that were bringing her there. Actually, maybe not that, but really to trap Jesus, in that whole thing.
Right, which was its own evil. No, I'm thinking where if we think about what we've classically known as church discipline, I think maybe the thought has been someone's misbehaving, someone's doing the wrong thing, and so you're not going to let them get by with that. And I think this tendency of what happened with the Corinthian church is what happens always in the church. I don't think this is some new, is we wrestle with the tension between punishment and restoration. And so often we can be dealing with it. We lean on the punishment side.
Yep.
And even in the Christian church, it breaks my heart a bit. I think we lean heavily on the punishment side. Even we look at it just in our country, we lean on the punishment side. This person ought to get this. Strong punishment. We don't lean into mercy as much and we don't lean as much into restoration, that where we want this person to be whole.
Right.
And I think one thing that breaks the heart of God, even when it comes to the church, is I think there are a couple of things that happen. I think we see some churches that go strong on the discipline side, maybe with a heavy punishment vision. I think there's also one other thing that I've seen is we're very selective.
Well, that was the thing I wanted to come to now. So people that believe in church discipline and that concept, which again is not, I haven't found that in the Bible anywhere, the words church discipline.
The church, right.
I mean, in Paul's situation, it was a singular event that was pretty, what I would say, over the top in one sense.
And ongoing.
You
have this ongoing.
But I've also heard stories, true stories, of people that were brought to like a board of elders because the wife was not going to the Wednesday night prayer service, and they were approaching it as an issue of there's the church discipline. So I'm like, okay, that's interesting. What about greed? What about ongoing lying?
Right.
What about ongoing corporate greed? What about it's just the selectivity of it is a little bit what's the word? Bothersome, curious, scary.
Well, it's uncomfortable. Right.
It's often, in my experience, attached to sexual sin.
Well, first of all, I can't think of a single instance. In other words, when I was growing up, in the church, that was always it. If you thought about church discipline, it was related to, okay, but there was adultery, there was
someone got pregnant out of wedlock.
Right. So this is where you would step in. This was where, so it was something that was extraordinarily rare, and it was somehow related to sexual misconduct. And what is heavy on my heart when we think about this is there are all kinds of sins that deeply grieve God.
Yes.
I think we grew up, the context we grew up in, there's no question about it. Sexual misbehavior was like at the top.
Yep.
We weren't generally dealing with murder, okay? And then that would have been right up there as well. But I mean, how often, I never saw a church discipline for someone, a murder.
Bob, since you killed Harold, we're going to have to remove you from the fellowship until you repent.
Right. That didn't happen.
From prison.
So we talked about the stuff that was really, really serious. And so I think this is where even the idea as it comes to, well, the church just needs to respond when you have something off the charts. And again, in our experience, that was sexual misbehavior.
And in my thoughts this morning, as I was pushing back our podcast 30 minutes, I was thinking it's interesting. Jesus seemed to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jesus seemed to speak a whole lot more about the sins of greed and hypocrisy than he did about sexual misconduct.
Right.
Far more. I probably need to go through all the Gospels and actually just do the number of times he dealt with sexual misconduct and greed or hypocrisy.
Right. And even
because even when I look at the woman caught in adultery, that was a fairly quick restoration process. Right. Now, here's the other side of that, because there's another side of this. So often I've read stories, I've seen where a Christian leader is guilty of sexual misconduct and they're restored too quickly or too easily, and then they perpetrate that over and over and over again, which is also a problem. So while I am absolutely for restoration, I believe that's always the heart of God. It's not a one size fits all kind of thing. Even how you approach that. I believe that forgiveness is it's a command. It's always the right thing to do. Right. But that doesn't mean our sin is without consequence in any number of realms.
Well, forgiveness and restoration are not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Forgiveness is one kind of step. And honestly, you can have forgiveness. You can extend forgiveness even when the other person is unrepentant or they.
Oh, absolutely.
In other words, I start with.
I think emotionally healthy people do that, right, even if the person never repents or even acknowledges their sin.
But restoration, even in a relationship, an individual relationship, a restoration with a violated or broken trust is rarely as simple, nor does the Bible call it to be as simple as, I forgive you, we're all good now. Let's move on. Let's just move on. There are all kinds of layers that come into play with the unique situation and walking the Spirit. Now we got to figure out what are the broken things. We've been talking about restoring.
Right.
We got to get what are the layers of things that got broken here? What are the things now? And what is it going to take to put those things back together and to even if you think about that word, Galatians 6:1, go restore, brother. The image or the word even there had the idea of resetting a bone, for instance.
Yeah.
Well, you think about if you break a bone,
it's not instant.
Right. You get a cast on right away. And maybe that's the first. Okay, maybe we're starting with forgiveness. But now we got a process. That thing's got to be encased for 6 weeks. We start thinking about it's just, I know that wasn't the primary point of that image.
Even a cast, though. Yeah, a new pattern has to be established. In other words, even an arm in a cast, it's reestablishing this pattern. This is broken. Right. You need to get back to this. So I was thinking part of the reason all of this came to me is even in my August hikes, I had a friend talking about my own situation. I went through a restoration process back in 2001, which was about a 7-month process. And we were talking about my situation. He was explaining it to another person because I had shared, hey, I'd been, as a pastor in a church, I had been in an emotional relationship with a woman on our staff. And so I went into a restoration. I confessed that I went into a restoration process. And the word he used was, Bruce didn't do anything that prohibited him from ongoing ministry. Or I can't remember the word he used. It was a Southern Baptist term. I can't, but it was that. What was it?
Yes.
All that to say, I had to go through the 7 months for me was the cast. I had to do the hard work of figuring out how did I get there? What was I looking for? What was I feeling? What was I experiencing? What was I trying to draw from a relationship that I wasn't drawing from other healthy relationships from Christ, whatever that was. But I realized that restoration process and being as long as it was, 7 months, which was hard for me. You know a little bit of my journey and all that. Yeah. But it saved my life.
Right.
It saved me from ever going down that road again.
Right.
Think about it. I mean, so it was a healthy restoration. I was removed from church for a while in terms of having any kinds of speaking duties, pastoral duties. I remember I would come in on Sunday mornings and I would vacuum a lot. I wanted to be serving in some way. Mm-hmm. But I realized looking back, that restoration process, it saved my life. It kept me from ever being in that situation again. So if a person and even in counseling now, if a person doesn't do the hard work to understand why did I misbehave, they're very likely to do it over and over again. Yeah. You've got to get to the core of what's going on in me that created that willingness to cross this line or to do something that I knew in my own heart was wrong. But when you do that hard work, and it does take time, it is like resetting a bone. You come out stronger on the other side. In other words, I've never broken that bone again. I've never broken that bone since.
Well, it's sobering. So, because I was walking with you in that season, that stretch of, and it's sobering because I know in that church setting, that there were those who said, "Oh, this is an overreaction." In other words, the thought was, "Oh, this isn't something that requires restoration. This isn't one of those that word that you're."
Well, it wasn't a go and sin no more moment,
right? But I think there were people who felt like, yeah, this isn't that big a deal, that they didn't get in bed together. There wasn't this thing. So again, where we always think, okay, now that's where that's
sexual misconduct that we have to,
where we think that's when you go pull out the church discipline, and then now the person has to be either removed / restored, all of those things. And I think he can even speak to whenever we encounter brokenness in relationships with the church. We want the easiest way. We want the most, but it's not. It's rarely
what's best. Yeah.
So you can look and say at that period of time and say, "Oh my goodness, that was good for me." I can look and say, and ultimately good for the church.
Hard on the church.
Extremely hard on the church. It wasn't the comfortable. It wasn't the easy. I was an elder in that church at the time. So you're making that decision, making that call, dealing with the different opinions in the church, whatever.
We watched the church just in congregation size go from around 250 to 100 in that season, which was very painful for me to watch. But even that was good for my restoration process. Right. In other words, how much significance am I attaching to the size of a congregation that I lead? All of those things I realized were life-saving for me. I had to deal with my own sense of significance. I had to deal with my own sense of where do I look for comfort or connection? Where do I need to be looking to the Holy Spirit for comfort and connection and for significance? There's just so many ways. There's so many good things that restoration process. And I'll also tell you, for people that don't know the story, maybe one of these days I'll write a blog about it. The restoration process itself was quite broken. Yeah. I mean, it just was screwy. I mean, we say there's no perfectly right way to do it. So I could look at all sorts of things that I wish they'd done this, or I wish, and Marlena would say, I wish they'd done this, because poor Marlena was kind of out there in the cold.
Yep.
But it still restored.
Right.
It restored me personally. It saved me. What is that? When you turn a brother from sin, you save him from a multitude of sins. Yeah. I mean, that's been very true in my life.
Yeah.
So.
But aren't we getting back to that same point of even, I love this, the restorative process is going to be flawed and broken. In other words, but we've got to guard ourselves against automatically just going to the easiest, comfortable thing, which is look the other way. So it can be, we know about this thing this person did, we're going to quietly let them go and they go off to another church. Or we're going to, there's this thing that occurred, this broken relationships, broken behavior, this thing, we're going to look for a quick, I forgive you, and okay, pat on the back, okay, we're all good here, let's keep moving forward. Or we just ignore. There's two people in the church who aren't talking. There's this thing and isn't the call, love demands that we enter the hard place. Restoration, if you think about it, is never easy. Even now we're thinking about medical workers. We're thinking about frontline. You're going into a hazard zone. You're going into risk. You're going into differences of opinion. And isn't Jesus always then calling the screwy church, the broken church? No, you can't run from that. Love doesn't run.
And you realize, I think the number one reason that I will ignore instead of restore is because I'm so aware of my own screwiness. In other words, it's a little bit like, who am I to talk to Roger about this thing? By the way, when we finish the podcast, I need to talk to you about something. No, that's not true. But there's a part of me that doesn't want to go enter the tunnel of chaos, because I'm like, they could easily turn this on me or deflect right back. Well, what about, and that's where I've even learned in counseling, only take on one issue at a time. If I'm coming to you about something, then don't come to me about something at the same time. We need to deal with one issue first. Otherwise it's deflection. And then the person learns that you can't bring it up.
Right.
It's not safe. But if I'm a safe person and Roger says, Bruce, I need to talk to you about something. There's a way that you've hurt me. There's a way that you've broken trust in our relationship. I have to be willing to listen to that, receive that, repent of that before I bring up anything about how Roger potentially hurt me. But I'm saying the reason I don't often, that I'll tend to ignore, is I'm like, well, I'm kind of a mess. Who am I to really say something to someone else?
Which means then, if we follow the logic, and
nobody's ever going to restore anybody.
Right. We can't ever.
Which is why most people are conflict avoiders.
Exactly. We find a reason. We find a reason not to go into the tunnel of chaos, not to do that. It's a side but related note of, I think I was wrestling with earlier. I think the other thing we have to wrestle with is, I think also the easy thing, one of the easy, but is like the sexual misbehavior that can be the easy route. That's where we're going to take things serious, because a lot of people can say, well, I haven't slept with the wrong person. I haven't entered that kind of relationship. but there are all kinds of other brokenness in the church. So what's sobering for me is I look at, we had a tendency to look and say, okay, sexual misbehavior. Now God hates that. So the church has got to really take that seriously. But then you look at like Proverbs, these 6 things does Lord hate ye, seven are an abomination to him. We start thinking about things God hates and abomination. We start thinking of murder and sexual stuff and a proud look, a lying tongue, the one who sows discord among the brothers.
Yep.
And I start, wait, God hates
these are abominations.
Arrogance, a proud look, plotting evil,
divisive people,
and I look and say, wait a minute, how, if we're going to listen to what God says about church discipline, I mean, if we're going to say, well, the church has got to be serious about sin, whatever, well, what about arrogance? What about people who are sowing discord? What about people that happening in churches? There are people that are gossiping. There are people that are believing, they're sharing negative narratives about other people.
Yep.
There's arrogance. Sometimes there can be exploitation or deceiving, various kinds of stealing or taking advantage. These kinds of things that are going on in the church. Well, you can't turn an eye to that. What I just found is, I think what happens with often with the church discipline mindset, it's we're going to go after the stuff I'm not doing. The serious stuff
is the stuff I'm not doing.
Is the stuff I'm not doing. But we pick and choose. Oh, the stuff that God hates, sexual misbehavior, murder, right? He's going to hate that kind of thing. But my arrogance, my divisiveness, some of Jesus' most
my lying,
powerful words were against being unmerciful,
right?
Harsh, judgmental. Is that showing up in our churches? I mean, if church discipline, what I mean by that is that if we're saying, hey, listen, brother or sister, you're not going to be able to take in the Lord's table together with us because of this arrogance, because of this divisiveness, because of this harsh and judgmental, well, we would be blown away. Well, no, that's not, you don't. But these are things that are breaking God's heart, and they're breaking up community.
Yeah. You actually sounded like an arrogant person when you said that. Well, we can't possibly, dismiss someone for arrogance. That would be silly. Well, but you're sort of proving the point. It's why we have to do this thing that we are doing. So here's where I wanted to finish, because I think this came to me and this is really good. Don't ignore, restore. In marriage relationships, don't ignore, restore. It's different because here's the thing I've watched in marriages, because I've done it before. We don't ignore the thing. We sort of punish it subtly. So Marlena hurts me in some way or does something that bothers me. And I'm like, okay, I don't want to bring it up and get into a big fight, but watch this. I won't say anything for the next 2 days until she feels really bad about this. Or I'm going to go on a shopping spree. We subtly punish instead. And I'm like, don't ignore, restore, which means you're going to have to come to that person. You have to come to your spouse. You're going to have to come to that friend and say, hey, let's talk about this thing.
Right. But, well, here's the thing. As you're saying that, I realize ignore is about me. Restore is about the other person. In other words,
this is deep. Say that again.
No, I'm just saying ignore is retreating to me.
Yeah.
Actually, ignore is.
It's easier for me to just ignore it.
It's comfortable. It's safe. It's not even what's best for the person. Here's the thing: when we're getting more of the heart of God,
we want what's best for the other person, even if it costs me something.
Yes. And if they're not healthy, it's not just about me. Ignore is they're unhealthy. I'm catching the brunt of it. So I'm going to retreat. I'm going to isolate. I'm going to punish, subtly or unsubtly. Right?
Yes.
But restore is not making it about me. Restore is, here's another person almost as messed up as I am. I want her to be whole. I want him to get closer to the heart of God. So what do I need to? I'm not retreating into self-absorption and my pain of the loss this person's creating. I want them better.
Yeah, and ultimately, then Restore is about us.
Well,
so it leads to us.
No, in other words, I always get a side benefit,
right?
And a restored relationship is good. That's what. But the focus isn't on me. That's a side benefit. In other words, here's the reality, and here's the funny thing: when I'm moving towards somebody else's relationship and wholeness, I'm getting better too.
Right.
I am restoring myself. I am restoring my soul.
It's interesting that I accidentally hit a button and up top it says Restore. I'm afraid to touch this little keyboard because it might turn off the sound and the video and everything else. But I hit a button accidentally over here on my keyboard, and the thing that came up is highlighted Restore. Just love that. I think that's the word for the day. Don't ignore. Restore.
Restore, yeah.
I have no idea what time it is.
Don't think about yourself.
That's covering up the
Think
time
about the other person. Because again, that's love. Love isn't focused on me, my comfort, my safety. It's focused on what does that person most need, regardless of the cost. So I do like that. We don't plan to come in with a quippy quote to give you.
But when we have one, I love it. Don't ignore, restore. So the Pastords have a new little t-shirt tagline, maybe a mug, possibly pens.
That's
the t-shirt would be
merch.
Fun. Merch.
You say we should have
Pastor could have merch. That's right.
Ooh, that's kind of fun.
You like that?
Well, there's this part of me then that also kind of reacts to commercialism and just, oh gosh.
We're selling doves in the temple.
I'm in this tension here.
I don't want to
sell
doves.
But I sure would like to see an Inglorious Pastords mug. That would be a lot of fun.
I think I may get a t-shirt made just for us.
Inglorious Pastords on the front and in the back says ignore.
Don't ignore.
Don't ignore. Restore.
It's good.
Laurel and Hardy.
Until next time, don't ignore. Restore. Yeah.